Okay, by way of introductions today, we have with us Matt Behrens, who is our Chief Information Officer. He's going to be going over some of the Exhibit A material. We have Anna Kochin, our Contracts Manager, who will be facilitating a lot of the Q&A and also reviewing some administrative materials with us. We have Joe Drejos. He is a GIS specialist with our office. He's going to be demonstrating the project selection tool and some other materials that you might want to know about related to our map. We have Greg Labey, our project manager at FG. Some of you may know Greg from the help desk. He's going to be reviewing the core application materials with us. Kent Van Meter, the Vice President of Client Services from FG, is also on the phone. Patrick Wilkie Brown, our Geospatial Coordinator, is with us today. And my name is Jessica Turba. I'm the Program Administrator, and I'm going to be facilitating part of the presentation. As I just mentioned, we do have an agenda here. So the administration and timeline will be reviewed. We have NOFA A and some general specifics about CPF, general being we're going to review all the materials. And then obviously, if you have questions, please put them in the chat or send them to the office. We'll review our broadband availability map, the core application, some of the application materials that you traditionally see in our NOFA. Some of them are new. We will have a request for confidentiality review. We'll go over our technical assistance resources, and then we'll have some Q&A at the end. As I mentioned, this conference is being recorded. The recording and the slide deck will be made available on our website within a week. Please, I think all of you came in with muted audio and video. Please keep it that way. Send any questions you have through the chat. Any answers that we provide today are non-binding on the office. If you would like a binding answer, please send that to ociogrants@iowa.gov. We'll provide that email address again for you. And with that, our timeline. Today is our NOFA pre-publication, June 15th, we published or pre-published our NOFA. Today, we are having our pre-application conference. Thank you for joining us. We will have from this day until July 7th, a window of opportunity for written questions to be submitted to the office, and we intend to post responses to those questions July 14th. The application window opens July 14th. We cannot accept any applications prior to that time. The application window closes August 25th, 5 p.m. We cannot accept any applications after that time. We intend to have all the application reviews completed September 22nd with a decision, hopefully also on September 22nd, with grant agreement negotiation and contracting completed by the end of October. Some highlights for NOFA 8. We have a little under $149 million in funding available. This is a federally funded opportunity from the American Rescue Plan Act Capital Projects Fund. Projects that are awarded grant funds of more than $5 million will have some additional obligation and reporting requirements. We're just bringing that to your attention as you're reviewing the NOFA and the grant agreement to pay attention to those monitoring reporting requirements. This NOFA prioritizes the 96 broadband intervention zones that were established through the ITQ process earlier this year. We are able to provide up to 80% of matching funds available to eligible service locations based on where that location is in the state of Iowa as related to our broadband intervention zones. We are asking for 100-100 build out. However, 120 build out may be proposed if it's scalable to 100-100 within 3 years. Allowable costs can include middle mile when necessary to facilitate last mile service. And all projects must be completed by September 30th of 2026. With Matt, I'm going to go ahead and transition to Exhibit A, and Matt Behrens will review materials for us.
Thanks, Jessica. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Well, it's great to see so many people on the call today. Always appreciate the chance to visit with all of you and answer some questions about an upcoming NOFA. So I'll be taking some time, as I usually do in this call, to go through our Exhibit A. So I'm going to share my screen, but I have to have that enabled for me by Jessica. So I'll wait for her to do that. And then we'll go through and talk a little bit about how you find the NOFA on our website and where we go from there. So Jessica, standing by for that assistance.
I have clicked the box to see if you can share.
You cannot start screen sharing while the other participant is sharing, is what it says.
So So I will stop sharing.
There we go. Perfect. All right. So I'm going to bring up, just as a starting point, where you find the NOFA on our website. So this is the OCIO's website at ocio.iowa.gov. And of course, as usual, if you hover over broadband, you'll see a lot of stuff in there about our programs. We always encourage folks to explore that if they are looking for background on the things that we're working on internally. Of course, if you select broadband grants here, you'll come to an archive of active and expired opportunities. Notice the funding availability number 8 is set forth there. And when you click inside of notice of funding availability number 8, you'll see this material. And the exhibit that I'll be going through today is Exhibit A, which can be located right here. So I'll go ahead and open that up and zoom in a little bit and share a few thoughts with you on this. Now, I'm not going to go through this Exhibit A line by line. For those of you who've been working with our program in the past, of course, this NOFA should look familiar in many respects. It contains a lot of the same materials and concepts that you would see in a traditional notice issued by our office. And I'll be pausing periodically to answer questions that you may have. So I'll stop as I go through a section and then ask Anna to read a question to me. So you'll find this document out there. There's 7 sections in the table of contents, and we'll kind of go through those one at a time. And to make the best use of your time, I'm going to kind of just touch on some of the high points here with a specific focus on things that are different in NOFA 8 that I just want you to be thinking about as you approach this opportunity. As Jessica mentioned, we're almost $150 million of American Rescue Plan capital projects funds in this NOFA. It is entirely federally funded. So this is one of those federal funding opportunities where we're bringing into the NOFA a lot of those federal program concepts that we're required to adhere to. However, one of the things that's new with this NOFA that is not a federal concept, but a program concept developed by our office is the broadband intervention zones that were submitted to us as a result of invitation to qualify number 1, or ITQ number 1. And of course, you can find those intervention zones out on our website and their locations across the state. There are 96 of those intervention zones throughout Iowa. And so this NOFA contemplates those intervention zones in a number of different places. I'll call your attention to those. And how we incorporate that concept into the evaluation, the ranking and prioritization, that'll become clear as we merge through this document. So 96 zones across the state, and depending on the ranking of that zone coming out of the ITQ, there are progressively higher levels of match to applicants that propose to build to at least 80% of the eligible service locations within any zone. And an eligible service location is also set forth on our map as any location that does not have 120 or faster service. So there's some key breakpoint there is we're always looking for that 80% of build out to the eligible service locations within a zone. And again, as Jessica mentioned, the build out standards here, and this is flowing down the requirements from Treasury, is 100/100 broadband. However, if you're unable to build 100/100 right away, you can propose 120, provided that it's scalable to 100/100 within 3 years. Collectively, in this NOFA, 100/100 and 120 scalable are called covered speeds. So you may hear me say that. That's what I mean. It's either that 100/100 or the 120 scalable. Lots of information here to review and think about with respect to the requirements that are imposed on allowable expenditures. We'll get to that, but always a reminder that you can incorporate, as Jessica mentioned, expenditures for Middle Mile Network for its acquisition or construction, provided that it's necessary to facilitate those covered speeds to those eligible service locations. So that takes us down into key program definitions. And of course, there's always lots of those. Many of you know what to expect with our NOFAs. And so I'll just kind of scoot through some of these. Pay some special attention to allowable expenditures because those are different this time. And we're invoking those U.S. Department of Treasury requirements. So if you dealt with us on maybe NOFA 7, which was funded through the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, that had its own set of requirements as well. So we're always pulling those in. Those expenditures have to be expended by September 30th of 2026. So that is the date at which we expect projects to be certified complete to the office, all expenditures to have been incurred. and we'll process your claim at that point. Of course, there's always disallowed expenditures as well, so keep an eye on things that won't be allowed or won't be reimbursed should you propose them in your project. And there are also some key things to remember. We always have a broadband map that's available on the same page as this NOFA was posted that I showed you. And that broadband map has an available as of date. That data is as of August 2nd of 2022. So it's a little older now, and we'll talk about some of the ways that we're going to deal with that throughout the NOFA. If you've been an applicant to our program before, you know there's always a core application, which is a spreadsheet that contains a lot of the information that describes your project. So we'll talk about that later on in this presentation. And then we have broadband intervention zones. Again, I'll call your attention to those. You can find a full and complete list at the link contained in section 1.29. And of course, those broadband intervention zones are also plotted conveniently on the map on our website where you will select your project as part of your application submission. Now, as with any federal program, there are lots of other requirements, and those are called out throughout this document. And so it's important that you, perhaps counsel as appropriate, take a look at those and make sure you understand what all of these requirements are saying. For the purposes of this NOFA, applicants are treated as fixed price subaward recipients. And that comes with maybe some lesser compliance and monitoring requirements than you would have seen as a subrecipient in NOFA 7. So that's an important thing to be aware of. And certainly, if you have questions about some of those differences, I'd advise you to talk to counsel. Also, feel free to reach out to our help desk for more information on what that means. This eligible service location, again, concept will show up, throughout. These are dots on the map that represent structures where no provider facilitates 120 broadband or faster. And so that makes them eligible under Capital Projects Fund. And we are seeking proposals from providers who seek to facilitate service to those locations. That means that within a commercially reasonable time and at a commercially reasonable price, that consumer can be served. We also have this concept of maximum funding request, and it gets a little more complicated in this NOFA because it's based on a combination of factors. And I'll talk about those some more, but keep in mind that we're going to calculate a maximum funding request based on the design of your application. Is it in an intervention zone? Is it not? Which intervention zone is it in? There's a formula that's set forth here we'll talk about in a little while that will result in that maximum funding request. And of course, you can always request less than the maximum funding, and that will result in increased points in the scoring. So I'm going to keep going here again. September 30, 2026 is the date when projects must be completed. And I will pause here in a moment to answer any questions that are in the chat. And there are some requirements. I'm getting some awful feedback right now. There we go. There are some requirements here about ownership of the network. And that's one thing that's a little different from our past NOFAs, these property standards. So please take a look at those and make sure you understand those obligations. I'm not sure that in this meeting is the best time for us to try to convey the meaning of some of those standards, but we're happy to visit with you about the interpretation. And as always, it's important that you understand those requirements and what they mean for your operation. So what are we doing in this NOFA? We're identifying projects. And so we're going to do that again through the project worksheet, that core application with reference to the broadband availability map. You're also going to be identifying total project costs. All of this looks very familiar to prior NOFAs where you have an Exhibit B, where in the spreadsheet where you're going to put your locations that are going to be served. You have an Exhibit D where you're going to set forth your budget. There are some additional things we're doing inside of the Iowa grant system this time. There's been an upgrade to the Iowa grant system since NOFA 7, and there will be a grants management guide that will be coming out, I think, as we get closer to the application acceptance window opening, if I'm remembering correctly, where you can see maybe some of the small changes. At a high level, there's just more things that we're going to be collecting inside of the grant system as opposed to separate exhibits or spreadsheets. So that may be one thing you notice. Hey, they used to ask for this here in an exhibit that I had to upload. Now they're asking me to populate a form that's directly in the Iowa grant system. So just something to keep in mind. Definitely not a big deal, but maybe a difference that you'll see. As with prior NOFAs, there is this opportunity for advance payment up to 50%. You've got to pass through some hoops to get that 50% advance payment. as you would expect with any program like this. And one of those hoops is passing a risk assessment. So if you have questions about the risk assessment or any of the preconditions for receiving an advance payment, please reach out to us, and help desk will be happy to address those questions. In terms of available funds, we've already mentioned this, a little repetitive, but almost 150 million is available. And here we get into some of the specifics on how those maximum funding amounts will be calculated. There's lots of ways to think about this and a lot of words that could be used, but I'll tell you how I think about it. Anywhere that you build in the state of Iowa that's an eligible service location is eligible to receive a maximum funding request or match. You build, you're eligible to receive that 60%. However, if you choose to build in broadband intervention zones, that triggers some plus ups in those matching percentages. Now, the increases are only for those locations that are within the intervention zone. So if you had a project that had some locations outside of the intervention zone and some locations in, no problem at all, that's perfect. But we reimburse at 60% for locations, up to 60% for locations outside of the intervention zone, and then at a higher level for the locations within the intervention zone. We put those two percentages together to create your final calculated maximum funding request. So you'll get some higher match inside the zone and that 60% if you're outside the zone. Now, again, in order to avail yourself of that higher match within a zone, your project has to facilitate service to at least 80% of the eligible service locations within the zone. So if you just build to one, like let's say your project had one location in the intervention zone and had 99 that weren't, you're not going to get the 80% match or whatever for that one location in that intervention zone. Your project would have to build to 80% of the locations in that intervention zone to receive the higher level of match that's available to the locations within that zone. Now, I don't want to, spend too much time on this, but when we're talking about match, I just want to repeat one more time. We're looking at match on a location by location basis. All right, so if your intervention zone is ranked between 21 and 40, you receive the 75% match for each of the eligible service locations that are within that zone. And if the intervention zone you want to build in is ranked 41 and below, then you're eligible to receive that 70%. So if you hit that criteria that we said, that you're going to build to 80% of the eligible service locations in an intervention zone, you're guaranteed at least 10% more than that baseline 60%. And then it goes up there based on how high the ranking is. Now, it is okay if that is confusing. There's a couple of things I would say. First of all, the core application, that Excel workbook that I mentioned, it will calculate all of this for you. And so you can do some scenario building and some what ifing, load that data into the core application. It will magically calculate these formulas to give you that maximum funding percentage, that match that you're eligible to receive. And again, I'll say this a bunch of times. If you have questions about it, that's the reason we have a help desk that's available for you to kind of problem solve and to think about what some of these different configurations and scenarios might actually mean. I'm going to pause here. Anna, do we have any questions that would make sense to answer at this point before I kind of switch gears?
Yeah, we have a couple. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Will applications be publicly available for review after the acceptance window closes? And will there be a challenge process?
There's always a challenge process in connection with an application with a NOFA. So that occurs at the end after the notice of intent to award. We don't have a public validation process built into this, but here's what I would say. Our approach to handling some drift in data between the map that's published there and things that you as a service provider may have done in the time that has since passed is to create a moment in between the NOIA and the execution of the grant agreement, within which we will work with the prospective NOIA candidate, the applicant, and say, we are aware of there being some build out in this particular area since the broadband map V5 was issued. And we'd like to work with you to write down that overbuild. And so that's going to be our approach for this. And I think one of the things that we would advise you to do is send that question to us as part of the written Q&A. We'll call your attention to that and then give you some more information about how exactly we expect that process to work. But, you know, one of the things that we're trying to be mindful of here is the relatively short timelines that are associated with this opportunity. And so we're trying to figure out how can we expedite this, but still satisfy that interest that we don't want to fund overbuild. In fact, we're prohibited from funding overbuild by the Treasury guidelines. And so we built in this process, but please send us that question. We'll be happy to talk a little bit more about it. Is there another one, Anna?
Yes. Can you select a portion of the intervention zone? And if so, is it funded at the same percentage designated for the entire zone, or must you serve the entire zone at 80% locations to get reimbursed at the zone rate?
Yep, that's another great question. So you can pick one location in an intervention zone. That's fine. You can pick one, you can pick 5, you can serve 1% of the intervention zone or 79% of the intervention zone. That's entirely up to you, but the maximum funding you'll get is 60%. The only way to get the higher levels of match for that intervention zone is to serve 80% or more of the locations in that intervention zone. So you can select any piece of it that you want. As long as it's an eligible service location, you can receive 60% match to build to it. But if you want the higher matching levels, you've got to get to that 80% standard.
What happens when you apply for multiple ITQs with different preferences or scoring? For example, ITQ 1 is funded at 80%, ITQ 21, 75%, ITQ 96 is 70% funding. Will this elevate the total score and state funding percentage across all 3 zones?
There's a couple of places where that factors in, because we expect and hope that there will be applications that bridge multiple intervention zones. Remember that the percent match that you get, those increased matches, they're not don't think of them as matches against your entire project budget. They're matches based on the number of locations that you have within an intervention zone. So we look at your project and we lay it out like an algebraic formula. You have so much percent of your project that's in intervention zone 1 and so much of your project that's in intervention zone 41. So for that part of your project that's in intervention zone 1, you're going to get 80% match for that proportion of your project. And for the proportion of your project that's in intervention zone 41, you will get 70% match. And then you get 60% match for the proportion of your project that's not in any intervention zone. We add those proportions together to create this adjusted maximum funding request that reflects the locations where you actually built. So that's how it's dealt with in the determination of match. But there's also scoring factors, and I'll talk about those in a little bit. And for the scoring factors, let's say that you built in intervention zone 1 and intervention zone 41. Your project, that single project that crosses those 2 zones, will get the benefit of the number 1 rank. We'll throw out the lower rank and we say, you build an intervention zone 1, your project receives all of the points. So it's handled a couple of different ways, but that's the general idea.
Is serving a partial intervention zone a 60% grant rate?
Well, if by partial you mean less than 80%, then the answer is yes. An intervention zone where you served 79% or 50% or 13%, those would all be completely allowable projects under this program, but they'll be reimbursed at 60% because you don't meet that 80% standard.
Will GIS data from the map, such as eligible locations and intervention zones, be available for download?
I don't know the answer to that. We have some geospatial people on. Joe, do you care to respond to that?
Yes, that is already available. Oh, go ahead, Patrick, if you had something to add.
Yeah, the only thing is that, yes, like Joe said, it is available on geodata.iowa.gov. And we'll also put a link on the website or on the map itself. The only thing that I would like to add in there, and we will be going over this later on, is if you decide to use that data for analysis and the application, that it must go in the input tab in the application form that we'll be talking about later in the proper format. We'll not accept an extra tab in there as part of the application.
Matt, I have several more questions. So if you'd like, I can continue to run through those, or if you wanted to continue with the
Well, let's go ahead.
NOFA.
Let's go ahead and take 3 more, and then we'll
Okay.
keep going because I don't want to run us out of time.
Sure. Can you confirm whether the source of funding is beholden to the BEAD rules or whether OCIO's granting is independent of the BEAD rules recently announced?
It is independent of BEAD. This is a separate and completely distinct funding source issued by the U.S. Department of Treasury under the American Rescue Plan. BEAD is issued by the National Telecommunications and Information Administration under the U.S. Department of Commerce pursuant to the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act. So they are separate and discrete programs.
How are middle mile costs for a BIS reimbursed?
So we would look at, I'd have to have that conversation. Why don't you send that in writing? I don't know the answer to that. We'll have to look. I mean, my sense of it is that they would be reimbursed at the 60 because they are geographically outside of the BIS, or at least in part geographically outside of the BIS potentially. What we're really looking at with BIS is the last mile connection for that reimbursement. However, please send that to us in writing so that we can confirm that's the right interpretation.
When choosing locations outside the BIS, are we choosing individual customer locations, census blocks, or something else?
So all of the maps at this point that are issued by our office are now based on locations, and those are primarily derived from Next Gen 911 geocoded locations. So they represent structures on the map. The census block concept is thankfully behind us. And so when you're doing project selections, you're selecting customer address locations.
You want a couple more?
Sure.
Okay. When can projects start? And I think I heard that the NOFA 7 procurement rules will not apply, correct?
The NOFA 7 procurement rules do not apply to fixed price subaward. In the fixed price subaward model, that is my understanding. That's also one to send to us in writing, and we'd be happy to clarify some of that, 2 CFR labyrinth for you to the extent that we can. But that's part of the I think motivation behind selecting this particular approach for NOFA 8.
And then there was a second piece to that
Oh,
question.
yeah. You're right. When can projects start? Jessica, do you remember if there's a specific date in the conversations we've had with Treasury for expenditures that predate the NOFA issuance? I can't remember. We may have to get you that in writing unless Jessica knows off the top of her head.
Why don't we give it to them in writing just to make sure that there isn't a caveat about construction versus, engineering or the things that could occur.
Yeah. No, these are good. They're the questions that we can't answer are always the ones we're excited to get because that, there always is more work to do on making sure we can clarify this for you. So. Okay, Anna, I'm going to go ahead and keep going here since I'm going to be way over time. I think I've covered this, the way we're going to think about the matching. And so that's one of the important ways that broadband intervention zones are introduced. Now, those of you who've worked with our program before are also familiar with the concept of partial overlap, where 2 competing applications in the past based on census blocks, but now locations, these applications include the same area. So application A wants to build to this address, application B wants to build to the same address. And we have to adjudicate those differences because we can't fund both applications to build to the same address. So only one can get it. And that's the first time we're going to introduce this other broadband intervention zone concept that's new called groups. So in the simplest level, we take all of the applications that we receive to NOFA 8 and they go into one of 2 groups, Group A or Group B. Now, what is Group A? It's applications that propose to build to at least 80% of the eligible service locations in broadband intervention zones. If you reach that standard, not only do you get the higher match, but you also get placed in Group A. If you don't build to 80% of the locations in a broadband intervention zone, you get placed into Group B. So there's Group A and Group B, and initially we sort. So then we use those groups to figure out some of these partial overlap questions. We also use them to think about the final ranking of applications to this NOFA. So it kind of goes like this, very simple level. You're going to look for an eligible service location. And let's say you have an application in group A and an application in group B. They both want to build to the same address. That location will go to the group A application. It'll go to the application that's proposing to build into at least 80% of a biz. So we'll take that away from the group B application. Then we'll look inside of each group. So we'll say, within all of the group A applications, is there any overlap? And if there is overlap between one fiber and one, say, wireless application, we will give that location to the fiber project. And then third, we'll just look at rank. So based on the ranking within each group after the scoring is completed, the higher ranking application would get that overlapping. So that might occur when you have 2 fiber applications within group A. The higher ranking application would get that eligible service location. So that's the formula, if you will, through which overlap will be resolved inside of the NOFA. And of course, there's a lot of reasons that we can also sort of think about partial awards. But before I hop into that, keep that group A, group B concept in your mind, because it'll come up again one more time as we proceed. So there's lots of circumstances where we have to award partial amounts. Those are articulated here. The classic example is we run out of money, and then at the funding line, we have one application we can only partially fund. So that last application would get an offer from us that would be less than what they had initially proposed. So that's an important section to understand and read. And of course, we're happy to answer questions about it as you think about this. Jessica's already been through the dates, so I won't repeat that. And then in section 1.7, you have some more information about each of these different sections and what they do. We're in the pre-application conference today. Thank you all for being here. That kicks off the written question and answer session. So between now and July 7th, you can submit questions to us in writing. We will provide a formal binding response on the office. So, and then we just kind of proceed stepwise through the calendar events for this program. Then the application acceptance window opens. You submit your applications, you ask questions, you work with our help desk to get your application ready. Then the application window closes. Then, as usual, we conduct an application review, which consists of technical review to make sure the applications are complete procedurally, then quantitative scoring, then we have a disqualification or an eligibility review. These are the same steps that we have always done in the past, but there's a couple of kind of wrinkles in this that I'll introduce here. This timeline for this funding is shorter than maybe we're ordinarily used to. So the projects have to be complete by September of 26. So we have a couple of things in here just to make sure that we're focused on the right things as we move forward. One of them is a high cost project worksheet. Talk about that some more. And the other is a large project worksheet. So high cost project worksheet, as you can imagine, for that, we're going to be looking at projects that propose very high costs per passing. For the large project worksheet, we're going to be looking at projects that propose very large projects in terms of geographic size. Those worksheets, you don't complete those until after the application review has started, and we'll contact you if you fall into one of those categories and have you complete those worksheets. And I'll talk a little bit more about those here as we get into some of the next steps of this. Quantitative scoring, this is 100% formula driven. You have all the formulas in here, so you know how we'll be calculating your scores. And then we go through, there's a number of reasons that an application could be disqualified. We always try hard not to do that, but section 1.9 will look to see if your application has any intersection with the disqualification criteria. Then we issue the notice of intent to award, conduct a risk assessment, and then work on negotiating and executing a grant agreement. Within this, and I mentioned this earlier, how do we resolve build out that's occurred since August 2nd of 2022 when the map was issued? This is in section 1783, where as part of the grant agreement process, we may evaluate with the grantee whether we have information about broadband build out since the as of date, and work with the grantee to determine how best to address any potential overlap that may occur. There's a number of procedures that we ask you to follow as you work with us through this process. This is a competitive a grant opportunity, and so we want to make sure you're, if you're seeking binding responses, that we're not providing them to you today. You submit a formal question to us, that you work with us by always contacting the OCI grants mailbox so that you can follow that formal process. And then we want to avoid any unauthorized contact with the office during this period. So always, you know for sure if you're using OCI grants at iowa.gov, it's authorized. I mentioned there's grounds for disqualification. I'll just zoom through these. A lot of them are very familiar to you. You know, it's not an eligible project. You're trying to build to locations that are not eligible service locations, for example. A lot of things that you won't encounter because they're unusual or rare, or, you know, you wouldn't submit an application that's designed that way. There are some things in here that you have seen before, and there's a couple of things that are new. This wireless project design worksheet was introduced in NOFA 6 or NOFA 7. So if you have a wireless project, you'll have to submit this component for review. And the desire there is to make sure that you're including the eligible service locations that are within the perimeter of your sort of wireless propagation map, but also that you're building sufficient network backhaul to simultaneously serve users. Then a couple of things here is grounds for disqualification relate to that high cost project worksheet I mentioned and that large project worksheet. So there may be a circumstance where someone submits a, you know, just an outrage, you know, let's say a high cost project worksheet. We had an application that was for $1 million per location. We might look at that and evaluate it further to determine if that was the most appropriate use of these funds. Or let's say we received a project that proposed to build out to the entire state of Iowa. And so when we're looking at the amount of funding that we have for this and the timelines, given all of the things that you all contend with regularly, supply chain challenges, availability of subcontractors, we want to make sure these are projects that can actually get built. And so that's the reason for these worksheets. I mentioned the grants management policies and procedures guide. That always comes out later. So Jessica will be issuing that at some point in the future so you can understand the compliance requirements. And then there's some additional terms and conditions in NOFA 7. Boy, I'm going to stop for 1 second, Anna. I'll take a couple and then I'm going to keep zooming here.
Sure. Can you do a joint application with a neighboring provider to achieve 80% ITQ coverage?
Send us that in writing. We've had that conversation, but I'm not sure that I'm recalling enough of the specifics to answer that on the fly, but we will get you an answer on that.
Can you provide an example of the completeness metric in Exhibit A?
Sure. Why don't you let me get to that, and then we'll talk about it when I get down to.
Joe has a graphic for that as well.
Oh, perfect. Okay, so we'll I'll talk about it briefly, and then I'll let Joe correct me where I made any awful mistakes that were in the wrong direction. So, okay.
If a company has discovered an area considered eligible that they now serve because it's been recently built or finishing a build, how do they go about getting that area removed as being eligible, or can they apply for funding on something they're in the process of building for these broadband eligible zones in these circumstances?
Well, send us that in writing if you would. I mean, generally speaking, if the project's built, there isn't going to be an affordance for you to receive reimbursement for something that you've secured the funding and completed construction on. Now, your question about limiting the ability of another person to come in and overbuild that pursuant to this grant program because it's deemed eligible is a fair one. And it goes back to that section on that I mentioned earlier on the review of with a grantee post NOIA of their locations. And so we'll provide some answers to you formally concerning the procedures for noticing us about that build out that's not reflected on the map.
Will
Okay.
the challenge? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. You got one more. I'll take it.
Okay. Will the challenge form be reopened? There appear to be a lot of discrepancies in the area this person's looking at.
There will be no challenge to the map in the traditional sense between now and the issuance of the next map. So there will the BEAD. I don't want to get into the BEAD program today because I think it gets confusing for people if we start mixing program concepts. But for the purposes of answering your question here, under the BEAD program, there will be a challenge process. And at that, it's that point when you have the next formal challenge opportunity under the program. Okay, I'm going to keep going here. There's a number of required forms, as you would expect, and as you're all familiar with. This is very similar to what you've seen in the past. So I'm not even going to stop going. I'm not even going to go through this point by point, but I'm going to pause where I know there's a difference or two. Here in the executive project summary, looks the same as it did before, but we added a component. If you spend any time looking at the intervention zones or any of the materials that were submitted by communities, all of which are available on our website, you notice that they are offering what we call community broadband capital. This is in-kind or financial contributions that the community has offered in a non-binding manner to providers who choose to build into the broadband intervention zone of their choice. So that could be that they passed a resolution at the county level to reduce some permitting requirement, or it could be that they are offering some amount of money to help match the build-out costs in an intervention zone. If you are proposing to facilitate broadband service within an intervention zone, if you're reaching that 80% threshold for sure, we would ask you to submit as part of that executive project summary just a description of how any of that community capital offered by the community applicant might be used as a part of your project. It's just a cross-check to make sure that you've evaluated, that you've considered it. You're not required to use it, but that you've looked at it and made this determination about whether it's useful for your project as proposed or not. And there may be circumstances where something offered by a community isn't useful to you, and so you have to disregard it. For example, if the example I always use is if the community is proposing offered like a no-cost easement to site a wireless transmitter on a water tower, that would not be useful necessarily for a fiber optic provider, ostensibly, and so you would have to disregard that component. But still, we want you to talk about it, acknowledge that you've looked, and tell us how you're going to use it if you can. So we've got demonstrated experience, this minority impact statement. As usual, we have central forms that we always have. So the project worksheet, which includes Exhibits B, where you're going to load your project locations, Exhibit C, where you're going to provide us with some information that's specifically tuned to the Capital Projects Fund, Exhibit D, where you'll provide your budget plan. That's what's contained in the core application. We also have a grant agreement that implements a number of the terms and conditions that are a requirement of the program. You've seen those before if you've been a grantee. Of course, every grant agreement is different as the program changes and funding sources change. So you'll see things in Exhibit E that you may not have seen in prior grant agreements. So be sure to look at that. Exhibit F is a certification authorization release form similar to those you've seen in the past. Exhibit G relates to any request for confidential treatment you might submit to the office. There's an application checklist in Exhibit H that you do not have to submit back to us. It is there for your reference and convenience, but it is not, there's no opportunity to submit it back to us. Again, if you have a wireless project design worksheet, I've already mentioned. We have these two worksheets that you won't submit during the application acceptance window. You will only submit if you're contacted by the office after the application acceptance window closes. It's the high cost project worksheet and a large project worksheet. Now, who is going to be contacted by the office to fill out these questionnaires? The top 25% of applications by cost per passing will receive the high cost project worksheet. So if you're in the bottom 75% of cost per passing, you won't get contacted. If you're in the top 25%, you will. And I want to point out that we bucket these applications by wireless and wireline. So it's the top 25% of wireline and the top 25% of wireless that will receive the high cost project worksheet. And the same with the large project worksheet. Those will be bucketed as well. Top 25% of wireline, top 25% of wireless, they will receive the large project worksheet. If you receive nothing from the office, you have nothing to do. But if you do receive that worksheet, then we'll ask that you complete it in order for your application to be accepted. And there's some information in the background there on why. And again, we want to make sure we have buildable projects. We have short timelines, so we want to encourage things that can get done. There is a product pricing requirements, affordability requirements within CPF. So there's a product pricing form that has some similarities to forms you've seen in the past. However, because of some guidance in the Capital Projects Fund, this time we're also asking for a signed letter from a representative of the community to be served, indicating that your proposed pricing for the covered speed package you're offering is affordable. And that can be a very simple letter from a mayor or a business owner saying, I believe that this is affordable at this price for our community. And again, contact us if you have any questions. So we're into scoring. We're kind of getting into the home stretch here. We have quantitative factors only, and we're going to be doing some rank ordering. Once we've scored these applications on the quantitative factors, we'll then do some rank ordering. And here we return to those groups, the group A and the group B. Everybody gets scored based on the specific formulas that are set forth here. But then, you know, the broadband intervention zone applications, what I call them, those applications that are going to build to 80%, they get placed into group A and they're rank ordered. Let's say there's 40 applications that propose to build out into broadband intervention zones at 80% of the eligible service locations. We rank those 1 to 40. They're in group A. Now let's say group B, there's another 40 in there. And those are applications that aren't going to build to 80% of broadband intervention zones. And we rank order those 1 to 40 based on the results of the quantitative scoring. But then for group B, we take rank number 1 and we change it to rank 41. It cannot rank higher than the lowest ranking group A application. And then we go from 41 down to 80. So we adjust the scores in group B following the lowest rank order. We adjust the ranks in group B, forgive me, the ranks in group B following the lowest rank contained in group A. So under no circumstance can a group B application be ranked higher than a group A application, which, you know, puts it lower down in the list. And the money, you know, at some point, if we are oversubscribed, there may be a diminished likelihood that funding will be available the farther down you get that list into group B. So quantitative factors, these look very familiar. Total eligible service locations facilitated. This is a count of how many locations you propose to facilitate service to. Efficiency, the same measure as you've always seen. Measure of cost per passing. Rurality, we're looking at that you know, geographic population density of the area that you're within, and completeness. Now I'm going to let Joe get into the weeds on completeness, but once you give us a project area, think of it as like a rubber band where the exterior points, the exterior eligible service locations, those represent, if you've snapped a rubber band around your fingers, those represent what we kind of call a convex hull. It's a shape that's denoted by the exterior boundary of all those locations within your project. Then you've got a bunch of locations that are within there. So that becomes your project area. Now, you don't have to serve all of the locations that are in there. You could decide you want to serve some, but not others. And if you do that, you'll get less than 100% on this completeness score. I hope it's that simple. I mean, that's the way I like to think about it, at least. If you serve all of the locations that are within that shape, that convex hull that's denoted by the exterior eligible service locations in your project area, if you serve all of them, you get 100%. If you don't serve all of them, then you get less than 100%. And that's the basis for calculating that score. And it's one of the challenges that accompanies a location-based model instead of census blocks, because census blocks are pre-designed geographic areas. And so it's easier to deal with area in that kind of mindset than it is in locations, but that's how we're treating it. Relative speed. Here we're looking at this, you know, two different categories similar to the past. We're going to look at whether you, pursuant to some of the guidance from Treasury, you know, whether this is a 100-100 application or 120 scalable. It's 100-100, you get all the points in that subcategory. That's 120 scalable, you don't get any. Average speed, we look at this the same way we always have, where we take the average of the upload and download speed set forth in Exhibit B, and then we compare that to all their applicants to give you a score. We've always, or always is maybe the wrong word, but we've often over the past had prospective product attributes. These should look the same. Availability is the same as it was. Latency is the same as it was. Performance credits is the same as it was. We have made some changes to data cap to tweak that definition to mean any imposition in any form that is imposed by a communication service provider on a customer that either cuts off service, throttles service, or imposes additional charges for amounts of data above a limitation. So feel free to let us know if you have questions about that. Now, Treasury has some requirements. They're here. Delivery platform, they prioritize fiber, so we prioritize fiber here. They prioritize applicants affiliated with local governments, nonprofits, or cooperatives, so we have to prioritize that here. They prioritize affordability, so we prioritize more affordable applications over less affordable applications. And we'll look at the monthly pricing that you submit to us and create a calculation based on kind of your upload and download speed divided by price in order to arrive at this this comparison with everybody else to get a cost per megabit to the consumer. And we'll use that to compare against each other to give you a score there. Lower the cost, higher the points. And then again, I've talked at length about this complicated federal matching fund requested notion. If you request less than the maximum amount you're eligible to receive, when you consider all of the locations you're building to and whether they're intervention zone or not, if you request less than that, then this schedule applies and you can receive additional points for requesting less. And finally, we have this intervention zone ranking concept. So you're going to get points, more points for building into higher ranking intervention zones than lower ranking intervention zones. And you get no points in this category if you don't build into an intervention zone at all. And again, the threshold there is that 80%. So this is, you get more points here for building to 80% of the eligible service locations in that higher ranking broadband intervention zone. Scoring rubric is here, so you can clearly see all of the things that we consider from a weighting standpoint, so you can know where points are provided throughout this. And then we get into all the attachments, which we've talked about. So you have Exhibit A we're looking at right now. You have the core application we'll talk about a little bit more with all those different forms in them, the grant agreement, the certification, request for confidential treatment, the checklist, wireless project design worksheet, the Iowa grants instructions, project selection instructions. Those are available now on Exhibit K, so you can figure out how to interact with the map. And we'll talk about that further. That high cost project worksheet and large project worksheet aren't available now and will be disseminated to qualifying applicants after the application acceptance window closes. Here are relevant references, including the location of broadband availability map, all the way through the CPF guidance down to the broadband intervention zones. And we have a glossary of terms, so in case you need some definitions there. And we have some special terms and conditions that are associated with a NOFA in addition to what you find in the grant agreement. And I won't go through all of that. So that is a quick tour, I hope, through Exhibit A. Anna, I can take a couple of questions and then I'll turn it back over to all of you.
Sure, we have several. Can you clarify the priority ranking of the biz? Biz 1 is ranked higher than biz 2 or higher than, or is biz 95 higher ranked?
Oh, 1 is better. 1 is the highest ranked biz, 96 is the lowest ranked biz.
Can we choose to service 100% of locations in a biz and nothing outside of it?
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. And in doing that, you would qualify for the 80% uplift, and which triggers both the higher match and all of the different places where I referenced the 80% structure. And this, you'd be fine. You could certainly do that.
Considering the map data is as of August 2022 and doesn't reflect that some locations are now served with 100 since that date, if we identify those locations, can we challenge their eligibility? Or at a minimum, is it acceptable to submit an application to serve those locations with no grant funding support?
So again, I send that to us in writing. That's similar in spirit, at least, to the question we got earlier, where we're endeavoring to work with applicants who have received a notice of intent to award from us to make those adjustments, as necessary to their applications to avoid a circumstance where there is overbuild because of that application on top of the map, just because the map is aging. And so we will talk about that further in the written Q&A and make sure that you're familiar with what those procedures might be.
If you have locations that didn't qualify in NOFA 6 due to census block gaps, but the locations are now eligible and included in an ITQ high ranking, and you're still building NOFA 6, are mainline costs on your own dime currently under construction to finish NOFA 6 reimbursable for NOFA 8, or just the drops for these now eligible locations?
Yeah, that's another, I apologize. That's another one that's probably better addressed in writing, since it's a very specific fact pattern that presents itself, but we'd be more than happy to take that on and try to get you a clear answer. I just don't want to make a mistake here and mislead you one way or the other based on what would be a guess.
Within the biz, there are locations that have the same service providers and same speeds listed that are marked not eligible or underserved, while the others are eligible or underserved. How can these discrepancies be addressed? So
I don't know if I fully understand the question, but the biz is just a geographic area. It's that same concept of the rubber band that's sort of snapped around the exterior points. It doesn't mean that there can't be ineligible locations within a biz, but we don't count any of those when we're factoring in that 80% threshold. Let's say hypothetically that a biz had 10 eligible locations in it, and it had 10 ineligible locations in it. That you're going to encounter circumstances like that. When I say that you need to build out to 80% of the eligible service locations within a biz to qualify for all the increased match and everything else, you just have to build to the eight of the 10 eligible service locations that circumscribe that biz. We're not asking you to build to the ineligible locations therein. But if I didn't get to the root of your question, feel free to send us that in writing and we'll provide more details.
If completing a project within a biz and serve homes that are between the underserved and unserved locations, would these drops in CPE be funded?
So if the question is, would we fund you to do drops to ineligible locations within a biz? I think I can say the answer to that would be no. We're only funding you to do the construction to eligible service locations. And that's true whether they're in a biz or not.
If we are outside a biz, will the same concept you used in the Group A, Group B convo you had earlier be applied? So FTTH will be awarded prior to wireless.
Yeah, so I'll refer you back to the partial overlap. Gosh, it's gonna, I'm terrible trying to remember where these things are exactly in the NOFA, but when we're dealing with partial overlap, it's a multi-step process that begins just by looking at Group A and Group B. If an eligible service location exists in both a Group A and Group B application, it's sent to Group A. But then we look at within Group A and within Group B, these competing applications by technology type and by rank. So there likely would not be a circumstance where, well, here's a circumstance where a wireless could win that. The wireless application was in Group A, and the fiber application trying to bid on the same location was in Group B. The wireless application will receive that eligible service location based on the kind of model that's set out there. Again, with the idea that our primary focus here is to get those broadband intervention zones completely served.
Post-construction.
Send us that one too. We're more than happy to provide clarification on that in writing for you.
Post-construction, what checks and balances are in place to confirm a provider does as they said they would in their application?
So there are a number of monitoring and compliance guidelines that are set forth in the federal 2 CFR guidance that we'll be implementing that include a lot of oversight of applicants. There's a number of certifications that are involved. And of course, we also look at, reserving the right to do field testing and auditing. And we have sort of deployed some of those concepts in the past. So there is a very comprehensive oversight regime, even though some of the requirements are diminished, like the procurement testing. There's a number of things that are contained both in the grant agreement itself and the relevant Treasury guidelines and relevant 2 CFRs that we can visit with you about if you have questions.
I have one more, Matt. Latency was a factor in previous NOFAs, but then was removed as a metric. How will latency be checked? Is it latency to internet exchanges, latency to known public servers?
Let's take a look here. It's in prospective product attributes. Latency means the average time it's estimated to take, expressed in milliseconds, from data to travel from the customer edge router ingress egress point to the internet speed test tool published at iowaspeedtestcustom.com. So if you have additional questions about that specific design, please do send us a question and we'll be happy to provide clarification on the measurement.
That's all we have for now.
Thank you, everyone, for your attention. I'm going to turn it back over to Jessica, I think.
Okay. With that, we are going to start with a map or a view of the map V5. Joe, do you want me to move the slides as you direct, or do you? Okay. All
Yeah,
right,
yeah,
here we
go ahead. Hi, thank you, Jessica. Yeah, I'm Joe Dreyhaus, GIS specialist at the OCIO. Just going to go over the broadband map V5. First talking about a little bit of the points that are ineligible, points that are eligible, and then get into a demonstration of the selection tool itself. And then I'll end with talking a little bit more about the completeness metric and how the selection tool relates to that. So go next slide, please. So this map here depicts prior funded areas, the CAFI, Connected America Fund, Phase 2, Rural Digital Tuning Fund, RDOF, and then USD Reconnect program. They kind of take away that from this slide is that areas that have been funded already, those have been already kind of removed from eligibility with our broadband V5 map. Areas that are built up to only 25.3 though are still eligible. And so all of those kind of have already been taken care of in the background with our map. You can go to the next slide, please. So in this is our current broadband map V5, the ineligible locations, they're receiving prior funding, et cetera. Those are all depicted in black, those points. The eligible points for this particular NOFA are depicted in the kind of bluish green points there. As kind of mentioned in prior to this, a big difference between this and prior NOFAs is that the locations are now depicted as actual point locations rather than as census blocks. You can go to the next slide. So the areas that we kind of want to hone in on for this NOFA are those eligible service locations that are in those blue points there. Also overlaid the broadband intervention zones, which have already been discussed in the previous presentation there. So these are all fair game for this particular NOFA. If you go to the next slide. Before I jump into the demonstration of the map tool, just want to point out some of the hyperlinks to some of these resources here. So the selection tool that I'm going to demonstrate is that first link up there. The instructions on how to select the locations and export it as the CSV files and continue with the core app and import those into that. That's in Exhibit K, that second link. And then both of those resources are with all of our other NOFA 8 general information there at the bottom link there. And so with that, I'll jump out actually to demonstrate. Okay, hopefully. I don't know if I can make myself disappear. There we go. So when you follow that link, it'll take you to this map here. It'll show the ineligible and eligible locations as well as the BIZs with their initially with the labels of their ranks kind of showing up there. Just as a quick orientation to all of the tools and widgets on the map, on the upper left here are controls on zooming in and zooming out. You can also use your mouse wheel to zoom in and out as well. If you wanted to find a specific location or place, you can type in an address, or you can just type in like a city or county name, and that should zoom you into that location as well. The tools on the top right there, by default, when you open up the map, this instructions icon will already be open. This just describes some basic information about the eligible, ineligible locations and the BIZs, some background information on that, descriptions of what those map tools are, and then some additional background information on the prior challenges, where we got the data, the sources of that, and then another link again to Exhibit K with the instructions on how to export the data from this and import it into the core app. And you can close this with the X button there, and we'll move on to the next tool here, which is the base map gallery. If during your selection, if you wanted to change the background base map from like the street map, which is what we have on as default, to something like imagery, you can do that from this widget here if that makes it easier for you to do your selections. next widget is just a quick filter that filters all of the BIZs by an applicant name. So if you're working with a particular community, you can select them from the list here, hit apply, and it'll zoom you into those particular BIZs that they've applied for this NOFA. You can hit reset, and that brings back all of the BIZs again. The next button is the layer lists. You can check these all on and off if it makes it easier for you to do your selections. One thing that you'll want to note is that some of these by default are all in black font, and some of these are grayed out. The ones that are grayed out are invisible until you zoom into the map far enough. So in this case, if I wanted to zoom in to Northeast Iowa, once you zoom in, the eligible and ineligible locations will pop in there. The other layer will gray out, and it's from these that you're going to end up doing the actual selection from. I do want to note that as you zoom into these locations, all of these are interactive, so you can click on a point and you can get a quick description of its location, its address, if it's received any prior grants, and what the wireline wireless values are that we have for it. The BIZs are also interactive in that it provides information on the applicant for that, some contact information, and then some other information relating to whether it or not it has community capital available for it, a summary card of basically what you're seeing within this pop-up, and then a list of the eligible service locations as a CSV in that link as well. So going into the actual selection tool, which has the arrow on it, by default, as soon as you select it, it'll be turned on here at this dark green, but you can turn it on and off by just clicking on it. There are 3 different selection modes on here: select by rectangle, select by polygon, and select by circle. I found that the select by rectangle and select by circle to be the quickest, but also kind of the least precise. So for example, if I'm selecting by rectangle, you just click, hold, and drag, and that'll select everything quickly on the map. You hit clear if you want to clear out the results that you just selected. You can select by circle. How that works is you click on one location on the map, you hold the button down, and you drag it outward, and that'll select how many are within the radius of that circle. But if you want to be pretty precise with how you select your locations, I would recommend using the select by polygon tool. And it's from there, you click and you start drawing the outer boundary of that polygon. So in this case, it starts drawing a line. It shows you the shape of that polygon. And then when you're done, you double click and it'll select everything in that area. Now, when it's time to, if you're happy with that selection with those points, and you want to keep all 126 of those eligible service locations for your application, you go to the 3 dots here, you select that, and what you're looking for is export to CSV file. When you select that, it'll take a few moments, potentially, depending on how many points you selected, before it downloads as features.csv. You'll open that up, and that gives you your table of locations. You can kind of see that 126 rows, but 126 records with a header row on there, or what was selected. One thing to note that as you're selecting, in the selection tool, this eligible locations layer, you'll want to make sure that's checked on. So if you try to select locations and you're not getting anything, make sure that that is also checked. Also, if you zoom out a fair distance, you'll see that it's grayed out now. You won't be able to select anything from this extent here either. Usually, depending on the size of your monitor that you're working off of, it's usually about a county or 2 in scale that you can zoom into approximately. So with that, I'll hop out of the presentation or the demonstration, and I'll go to my last slide here to talk about how that selection relates to the completeness metric. So try to do a quick graphic here to demonstrate what we just kind of went over here. On the left, when you're in that selection tool, You draw out that selection polygon, it'll select everything in those bright blue points there. And in this example, you get 154 locations. Now, what'll happen after you go through the core app, you submit it, as we're doing the evaluation of those within our GIS, we'll run a process that creates basically like an envelope around all the outermost of the eligible service locations. That's that rubber band effect that Dr. Behrens mentioned earlier. And in our example here, that red dashed line will represent that outer envelope or rubber band that encloses everything. Now, in this example, there were 7 additional locations within that region. And so when we go to calculate the completeness measure, it's going to be that 154 plus those additional 7 to give us a total of 161. And so dividing 154 by 161 will give us that 90, it's kind of hidden down there. It's like 96% or so would be the completeness value. And so that's how that would be calculated. And with that, that concludes my portion of the presentation.
Thank you, Joe.
Yep.
Anna, do we want to try just a couple of questions if there are any about this?
I have one question, Mike. I have your question in the box, but it seems like it is a great question for Matt, so I'm going to hold it till the end. We didn't, Joe, you did such a great job. We don't have any questions about the map, so I'll just pause on that.
All right, we're going to transition next to a review of the broadband core application, and Greg is going to help facilitate that review.
Hi, everyone. My name is Greg Levy, and I'm going to be providing an overview of the various tabs and function of the core application workbook. For the purpose of today's presentation, this will be fairly high level, but we will be posting a core application tutorial on the OCIO website, the NOFA 8 site, that will guide you through the details of each section. And then, of course, the help desk always available as well. One important thing to note about this core application is that it is an Excel workbook with macros. So you want to ensure that your machine and Excel application settings are such to allow macros to function, as that is what allows the core application to do the calculations that you'll want it to do. We will cover some steps on how to do this in the core application tutorial, but of course you can always Google or find information online about how to allow macros to run. Next slide. So this is the menu tab of the core application. It'll collect some organization information at the top of the screen, study area code, provider ID, and FRN. These are all identifiers that are assigned by the FCC. We will provide a provider ID table that will be available for reference once the application window opens. But most of these codes you'll likely know from BDC reporting. The menu tab also has step-by-step instructions on how to complete this core application. It's got a list of hot buttons on the right-hand side that allow you to jump to the various tabs within this workbook. And then there, I have highlighted on screen there, the second button down for step 2 is to refresh Exhibit B with ESL input tab data. We'll show this here in a little bit, but that button is a functional button that will populate Exhibit B from this ESL input data that you provide from the map. And then at the bottom of the menu tab is a checklist, and we'll cover that in a moment. But now let's move on to the ESL tab. ESL, as Dr. Behrens mentioned, stands for eligible service locations, meaning those blue dots on the broadband map that we were just looking at, or locations that are unserved and underserved, as defined by 25.3 and 120. You'll follow the steps from that map selection, export and import instructions that Joe had just mentioned to select your project area and export the data to a CSV file. You would then copy and paste that data minus the header row into the fields on the ESL tab. And then once you've pasted that in, you'll return to the menu tab and click that refresh Exhibit B button that I had previously mentioned. This will populate Exhibit B with the location data, and that data is used to auto-calculate some of the figures throughout the application. And it will also snap you to Exhibit B. Let's skip to the next slide, Jessica. So this is an example of Exhibit B with sample data populated in it. So once you click that button, it's going to snap you to this screen. You'll see all your address locations that you exported from the map selection tool and copy pasted into that ESL tab. So at the top of Exhibit B, we're going to collect a little bit of information from you. One of those will be the delivery platform that your project will deliver broadband on. Please know that you can only select one of these. If you're proposing a project with multiple technologies, they will need to be split into separate projects. The application calculation section in the middle, those are going to be auto-populated as you complete the required steps on remaining tabs. So you'll have the total number of broadband units that you've selected. Those are the eligible blue dots on the map. Will populate there, and then we'll get cost per passing will populate after you have completed the budget section. The prospective product attributes, Dr. Burns went through in some detail previously: availability, latency, performance credits, and data caps. So those will be populated on this form as well. Now down within the Exhibit B project worksheet on your list of addresses there are a couple of things where you can provide additional information. And that is for facilitated units and CAIs, or community anchor institutions, as applicable. So the map export is going to default every location to a unit count of 1. But if you're aware that a location is a multi-unit dwelling, an apartment complex, condo, that type of thing, please indicate the number of units there in that units column. And then the same with community anchor institutions. If you can indicate yes, if you know that it is a community anchor institution, would be great. And then lastly, on this tab, you will need to populate the maximum download and upload speeds that will be available to each location upon project completion. So just a note on that, that is the max. This is not the max advertised speed, but it's the delivered speed. So we'd want you to consider any impact that distance or other factors may have when populating this section of the form. Next slide, please. Okay, on to Exhibit C. OCIO has improved the functionality of the core application. In particular on this tab, most of this is going to be auto-populated for you based on your map selection, that ESL tab input. This screenshot is what it looks like prior to completing the other tabs. I'll show you an example with some sample data in there here shortly. The total estimated cost and the grant requested, will populate from Exhibit D, the budget, once you get that entered. The maximum funding request will also be auto-calculated, just as Dr. Burns had discussed in his portion of the presentation about that maximum funding calculation. And then there is a section here. So if you're requesting something less than the maximum funding, you can enter that in here in 1.2. It will auto-populate with the max percentage. So if you're requesting the maximum, there's nothing needed there. And then lastly on here is a reporting requirement of the Treasury to report the miles of fiber in each of your projects. So obviously for fiber projects, if it's a wireless project using fiber backhaul, put those fiber miles in there as well. Next slide, please. So this is an example of that Exhibit C with populated data. So when you put in your locations that copy paste from the map selection, and you populate it in there and click that button to populate the application with those calculations, you'll see in Exhibit C here, there's a little table, a BIZ table, broadband intervention zones. So it's going to have the ID number of each intervention zone that you have selected in your project. This particular project has 4 of them in it. So apparently I grabbed a big swath of ground here. But you'll see that it separates them out between the various BIZ that may be selected in your project area, as well as non-BIZ locations. So then it'll tell you the % of locations within each BIZ that you've selected. So in order to hit that 80% threshold that Dr. Behrens referred to, you can do a check on this this table here in Exhibit C to see how close you are. In this particular example, the lowest one looks like 95.9% of locations. It also tells you the total number of locations that are available in that biz, as well as the locations that you've selected. So that's where that percentage comes into play. So you'll be able to, you know, tweak and adjust your project if you desire, if you're very close to that 80% and want to get that increased match percentage. Okay, let's move on to Exhibit D, and this will look largely familiar to most of you that have participated in previous rounds. But the office has simplified this by eliminating what you may remember from previous rounds as D1, which was costs associated with essentially middle mile, but things outside of your project area. So instead, you will just enter the total estimated costs to complete your project on Exhibit D. There's no need to differentiate between inside project area and outside project area. You'll see a list of categories for costing on the left. These are certainly not all encompassing. So if you don't see an exact fit to something in your project, just pick what closely mimics it. There's also an other category there. And then just put in a brief description in column B explaining what that is. One thing we won't allow is for you to put all of your costs on one line, like putting all of your costs in other. We need to, for reporting and for claims purposes at the end of your project, we need to break those out to show them in the various categories of your project. Next, for costing in column C is per unit cost. So you'll see, you know, various measurements. Conduit fiber are listed by the foot. So you know, if you were to purchase materials in a different increment than what's in the application, it may require a little bit of calculation on your part, but should be pretty straightforward there. Then you'll enter in the quantity of those. So if it was, you know, 10,000 feet or whatever it may be, you'd put that in the quantity. And then the application is going to calculate the rest of the columns for you. So this is where it'll sum up your total estimated costs and then calculate the max grant percentage, as well as your final potential award percentage there as well. All right, and next slide. So after completing all the information in all tabs, you'll come back to this menu tab, and this is where the checklist at the bottom comes into play. So I've got two examples on screen here. One is with nothing complete. You'll see it's all highlighted yellow, and there's little cues to help you determine what you're maybe missing there, compared to the screenshot at the bottom where it's going to tell you complete. So as you complete sections, those will flip over to complete to help guide you along there. And next slide. So we will be talking here shortly about requesting confidentiality, but just wanted to talk to you about the process to redact cost-related data if you're choosing to do so from Exhibit D of your core application. There's actually a function built into this that will produce the PDF that you'll need to upload into Iowa Grants for this. So if you are requesting confidentiality of this portion of your grant application, you'll be asked to upload not only the unredacted version, which is that Excel workbook, but then you will also do a redacted PDF that will result from this process here. The core application will actually produce that for you. So the first step is emailing OCIO-grants@iowa.gov to indicate that you're requesting confidentiality. And OCIO will then reply with a password. So if you were to go into the application today and click that redact button, it's going to ask you for a password. So that OCIO will reply with that password. You can, once you have that password in hand, you click that redact button, and what it's going to do is produce a PDF of your application with those costing columns blacked out. And then it'll give you a little pop-up on screen telling you that it's going to save to your documents folder on your machine. So, and again, we'll provide a tutorial that will go over this core application and all of these steps in detail. So be sure to check that out if you have questions once the application window opens on July 14th. And that's all I have. So I will turn it over to Anna Cochin, the contracts manager for the OCL.
Greg, I'm gonna pose a question to you. I'm not sure if this is up your alley. If not, we can save it for the end. But in the core app under the general applicant information, what needs to be entered in the FCC provider ID field? Should this be the SPIN number?
The FCC provider ID is, I think, also referred to as your BDC ID, broadband data collection. It's an FCC term.
I'm cross-referencing that to see if that is the same ID.
Okay.
I don't think it is though,
Okay, fair enough.
but we will provide information for that.
Yeah, and there will be a table that we'll have linked within Iowa grants when it comes to this question in there, and there'll be a link to it. So I imagine we'll post that on the website as well. So you can look that up, but you can also go to the FCC website and look up your codes as well.
Kevin, if you want to send us that in writing, we'll get something formal posted as an addendum. Sounds like we still need to just check into that. Patrick, since you're here, I have a couple of questions that you might be able to answer. Or Joe, perhaps. Can statewide data sets be downloaded?
Yeah, we answered that earlier, and those will be available at geodata.iowa.gov, and we'll post that information both on the map and on the NOFA 8 webpage someplace.
Okay. I have two that I'm just gonna hold till the end. I think they might be best for Matt. So just know that if I haven't gotten to your question, I haven't overlooked it. We'll get to it at the end. Okay, I wanted to talk about Jessica. I think there's a slide before this about the application checklist. Is it afterward?
Oh, there we go. Sorry, it was just.
That's okay. I didn't want to skip all this good info. So there are several components to your application. We've put together this application checklist just to help you stay organized. This does not get submitted with your application. This is just for your use. You don't have to use it, or you can use it. It might be helpful. And then just some tips along with this information. We'll ask that you fill out general information as a web form in the Iowa grant system. Please use your legal business name. We'll need this for contracting and for claims purposes. Regarding your applicant and owner organization, there's an upload required. If you indicate that there's a parent subsidiary relationship, we'll ask for you to upload a PDF so that as a visual so that we can see that. The executive project summary is a web form in the Iowa grant system. It's here. Well, you'll indicate your completion date. It cannot be later than September 30, 2026, but it can be sooner. And whatever date you indicate there, that's the date that we'll have in your grant agreement and we'll hold you to. Demonstrated experience is an upload. Please see section 224 of the NOFA regarding information that can be included in the demonstrated experience. As usual, minority impact statement is a web form in the Iowa grant system. As Greg talked about, the core application is an Excel spreadsheet. You'll upload this as part of your application. If you choose to have your core application redacted, you have to upload both the unredacted and the redacted version. And also the budget amounts that you indicate in Exhibit D of your core application, there's also a budget component in the Iowa grant system. So please make sure that those numbers are exact. The grant agreement is an upload only if you're offering red lines. If you agree to the terms and conditions as they're written in the grant agreement, you do not have to upload the grant agreement. Exhibit F is the certification and authorization form. This is an upload and it requires your signature in 3 different places. Form 22 is the confidentiality form. This has to be filled out regardless of whether you're requesting confidentiality. You'll either sign that you are not requesting confidentiality or that you are. It's one form, but there's 2 different sections. Exhibit I is only required if you're proposing a wireless project. This is the wireless project design worksheet, and you'll upload both the signature page and your design. And then last is the product pricing form. We've moved this into a web form. So you'll fill out the pricing structure as a web form, but then the community letter has to be uploaded as a PDF. Next slide, Jessica. Thank you. Okay, so then I just wanted to point out a couple of things with the request for confidentiality. Again, you have to sign it even if you're not requesting confidentiality. And here I've listed a bunch of things that you cannot request confidentiality for. In short, you can only request line item costs in Exhibit D. You'll see that if you contact this office and work with Greg to do the redaction, that it only will redact those certain pieces. Within the form, though, there's a chart that you'll fill out indicating why you think it should be marked confidential. And then you'll submit this form to us. And again, just please, you'll have to contact the help desk in order to redact your core application. But if you need any assistance, just let us know regarding that Form 22. Next slide, Jessica. Thank you. And then last, this is just a quick reference. If you bump into, if you hit any snags and you need some help, if you need help registering for an Iowa Grants account, pretty soon we'll have Exhibit J available to you. That's the Iowa Grants registration and application instructions. If you need help with the core application, Greg showed us that menu tab that'll point you in the right direction. For help choosing your project area on the map, we'll have Exhibit K. It's project selection and data export import instructions. And then last, if you have questions about the NOFA itself, you can submit questions now and we'll try to take them. Otherwise, you can submit your questions via a link on our website for the question and response period, and responses to those will be incorporated into the NOFA as a binding response. And those will be posted as of July 14. And then just some overall reminders. All the application documentation that you've seen here today, plus more, is at ocio.iowa.gov under the NOFA 8 banner. We'll be publishing some additional tutorials in the meantime. Please keep in mind that application deadline. It cannot be extended. So it has to be received, meaning submitted through the Iowa grant system by August 25th at 5 p.m. And again, if you require any assistance, please you can email the help desk. Please do that at least one day prior to the deadline so that we have time to get in contact with you and help you get that across the finish line. That's all I had to talk about. We do have several questions. Matt, if you're ready.
I'm here.
Okay. If a company commits to serve a biz zone at 80% or more, but later the OCIO discovers that a large number of locations are already FTTH and become ineligible, and that somehow lowers our 80% build out below that threshold, how will that be addressed?
So that procedure is located between the notice of intent to award and the grant agreement negotiation. So at that juncture, it cannot affect scoring and ranking. It doesn't mean that there won't be impacts for the final negotiated project that we agree to fund. because we may have this information that would require us to make those adjustments. But at that juncture, after the notice of intent to award, there's no opportunity to go back and refactor scoring.
Will licensed microwave backhaul be treated same as fiber? Many of our microwave links have a better uptime than fiber.
I would submit that in writing. I mean, to the best of my knowledge, there's no prohibition against any specific type of backhaul that could be used under this program, but we'd be happy to, make sure we fully review the documentation and confirm that statement in writing.
From a structure perspective, is it preferable to OCIO to propose multiple responses covering one biz each, or one large response per application covering multiple biz?
I don't know that OCIO has a strong preference. Keep in mind that let's take the large project worksheet that I mentioned in my section of the presentation. We're going to look at that build out in aggregate. So it's not going to be based on, the size of a single application, but on the size of all of the applications collectively that any applicant has submitted to us. When you think about how you want to organize your project in terms of one big one or some little ones, it's really up to you how you decide to do that. And we've gotten that question a lot through the years, and I don't think there's a one size fits all answer. You can do some scenario building with the core application to calculate, if there are, and with reference to the formulas to calculate, what you think would be the best approach, but we're not certainly providing a recommendation in this context or any specific guidance about which of those paths is the best for your circumstance or for the projects that you want to build.
If we're proposing a fiber build out project, does a design not have to be submitted?
The wireless design project worksheet is, I believe, what you're referring to, and that only exists for wireless projects. It does not exist for wireline projects. There is no requirement for wireline projects that you submit that worksheet.
If an applicant chooses to build to 120, is September 30, 2026 the deadline to increase the speeds to 100?
That's a great one to submit to us in writing. I believe, and I could be wrong, so the formal question would be a better way to handle this, but I believe that it's 3 years from the date of project completion. So you have until September 30, 2026 to build your 120 project, and then you would have 3 years from there to rise to the 100 standard. However, it's always better to submit those in writing, because if I'm working from memory and I may have made a mistake in my interpretation of the rules.
Those are all of our questions today.
Very good.
Okay.
Jessica, you want to bring us home?
I guess so. So shockingly, we stayed within the time allotted and we got through the questions. So please feel free to submit any additional questions in writing via the form that Anna referenced, and we'll make sure that we post our responses July 14th. Otherwise, you are free to go. Thank you so much for participating in our conference. All right, team, I'm going to stop the recording, and then I'll see you guys over